Las Vegas, 1972. The Hilton showroom glitters like a palace, every seat filled, 18,000 voices rising as the orchestra swells. Then he appears, Elvis Presley, draped in a white jumpsuit studded with Swarovski crystals, his presence so electric it seems to bend the air itself. The crowd erupts, a storm of applause crashing over him. For a moment, it feels unstoppable, untouchable, until a single voice slices through the roar. "Sing something real, Elvis!" The words hang in the air like a challenge thrown at a king. The room falls silent. Glasses pause halfway to lips. Hands freeze mid-clap. Thousands of eyes turn from the stage to the shadows, searching for the one reckless enough to break the spell. The orchestra falters, then stops altogether. What was triumph just seconds ago now teeters on the edge of collapse. Elvis doesn't move. He grips the microphone, his face unreadable, and stares into the darkness from where the challenge came. The silence stretches, unbearable. Fans expect anger, a sharp retort, maybe even for security to drag the man out. Instead, Elvis lets the moment swell. The quiet so heavy, you can almost hear the pounding of 18,000 hearts waiting for his answer. No one knows it yet, but the next words, and the song that follows, will turn this glittering Vegas show into one of the most unforgettable nights of his life. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas, 1972. The Hilton International Hotel towered like a glowing palace on the desert horizon. Inside, the grand showroom pulsed with expectation, its mirrored walls reflecting the glitter of chandeliers and sequined gowns. That night wasn't merely another performance, it was an event people planned their lives around. To many, scoring a ticket meant telling stories about it for decades to come. The audience was a study in contrasts. At the front, high rollers from New York and Los Angeles lounged in tailored suits, their gold cufflinks catching the light as they sipped expensive bourbon. Their companions, heiresses, models, and socialites, leaned back in their chairs, their laughter sharp, rehearsed, and dripping with status. But scattered among them were people who had saved for years just to be there. Steelworkers in their best Sunday coats, middle-aged couples who had flown in from small towns, wide-eyed kids gripping programs as if they were relics. The electricity in the air united them, despite the gulf in their bank accounts. They had come for the same reason, to see Elvis Presley, the man who had redefined music, standing alive and real before them. The orchestra began to tune. The hum of brass and the pluck of strings only heightened the suspense. Waiters scurried, clearing glasses in hushed movements, aware that a single clink at the wrong moment could draw glares. Then the house lights dimmed, conversations tapered into whispers, then into silence. A low, thunderous cheer began in one corner and rippled outward until it became a roar. From backstage, Elvis appeared. The spotlight cut across the stage and landed on him, draped in a white jumpsuit embroidered with glittering stones that caught every fragment of light. The garment wasn't just clothing, it was armor, a costume that announced a man larger than life. Yet behind his slow, deliberate stride, there was something else, harder to see, but impossible to miss: the weight of expectation. He smiled broadly, flashing the grin that had once scandalized America's television screens, but those closest to him would have recognized the flicker of tension beneath it. He was the king, yes, but even kings are human when 18,000 eyes pin them in place. The band struck its first notes, brassy and commanding, and Elvis lifted the microphone. His stance was relaxed, knees slightly bent, shoulders loose, as if the stage were an extension of himself. Every movement had a rhythm of its own. He tilted his head, shook the dark waves of hair from his brow, and let the sound of the crowd wash over him like a tide. They believed he was in control. But inside, his thoughts churned. Each show in Vegas was a trial. The glamour of the Hilton masked the fact that he battled fatigue, loneliness, and the gnawing suspicion that some in the audience weren't there to listen, but to judge. And then it happened. Just as the first song ended and the hall thundered with applause, a voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Sing something real!" It wasn't the playful cry of a fan. It was sharp, laced with disdain, hurled like a challenge from somewhere deep in the crowd. For a second, the hall didn't seem to know how to react. Gasps rose, mingled with a few uneasy chuckles. A handful of people hissed back at the intruder, while others craned their necks to locate the source. Someone began to boo. Another shouted, "Shut up!" The harmony of shared anticipation splintered into confusion. Elvis froze. His hand, still gripping the microphone, hung in the air. The orchestra, trained to read him with military precision, sensed something had shifted and cut their notes abruptly. Brass, strings, percussion. Everything halted mid-breath. The sudden silence was deafening. In that pause, a strange alchemy took place. The crowd's elation curdled into tension. Every eye locked on him, waiting. The man they'd come to see as invincible now stood at a crossroads. He could laugh it off, lash out, ignore it altogether. But his stillness was deliberate, even theatrical. He turned his head slowly toward the sector of the hall where the words had flown from. His gaze was steady, almost searching, though he couldn't possibly pick out a single face among thousands. He didn't speak. He simply held the silence, stretching it until it became a weight pressing on everyone in the room. The same audience that moments ago had screamed in ecstasy now held its collective breath. A single cough echoed faintly from the balcony. A glass clinked against a table, startling in the void. Time seemed to elongate. The man who had ignited a cultural revolution with a single swivel of his hips now held power through absolute stillness. The psychology of that moment was undeniable. People leaned forward in their seats, hearts racing, not from music, but from anticipation of confrontation. They expected a rebuke, maybe even a mocking quip, something to put the heckler in his place. Instead, Elvis let the pause thicken, his expression unreadable. For those who had followed his career from the 1950s, it was a reminder of the fire he had always carried beneath the surface. But this wasn't the same young man in a pink Cadillac outside Sun Records. This was a figure who had seen fame rise, falter, and resurrect itself through sweat and willpower. His silence now wasn't insecurity. It was strategy. The atmosphere in the Hilton ballroom shifted palpably, like a storm front rolling in. The high rollers who had been whispering smugly now sat rigid, unsure. The steel workers in the cheaper seats clenched the edges of their programs. Somewhere, a woman whispered a prayer. What had started as a night of glitz and glamour had transformed into something else entirely. A standoff between one man and the weight of expectation, crystallized by a single voice from the dark. Elvis tilted the microphone closer to his lips, the faintest smile beginning to form, and the room waited, suspended on the edge of whatever would come next. The stillness broke not with anger, but with something no one in the Hilton showroom had braced themselves for. Elvis leaned slightly forward, the microphone catching the low hum of his breath, and let the faintest grin crease across his face. He didn't sneer. He didn't dismiss. Instead, his voice rolled out warm, tinged with amusement, but sharpened with meaning. "Something real, huh? Tell me." What do you think is real for me? The effect was instantaneous. The tension that had wrapped the room like a fist loosened. A ripple of laughter swept across the audience, followed by applause. Yet beneath the humor lay a challenge, one that landed with quiet force. It wasn't mockery. It was a dare cloaked in charm, a reminder that authenticity wasn't measured by an audience member's demand, but by the man holding the microphone. He straightened, gave a subtle nod to the orchestra, and everyone expected the program to continue as rehearsed. But then he lifted a hand sharply, palm outward, halting them before they began. The musicians froze, surprised, but obedient. Elvis turned back toward the crowd, and instead of launching into the next glittering Vegas number, he bent down, almost as if listening inwardly to a different rhythm altogether. And then he struck. Without warning, he slid into the opening lines of a song that hadn't graced a Vegas set list. The raw chords of a Sun Records-era tune filled the air. That's All Right, the one that had cracked open the world in 1954. His voice, stripped of polish, rang with the same urgency it had when he was barely out of his teens, shaking Southern clubs with something nobody had a name for yet. The house band scrambled to follow him. A few of the older players grinned in recognition, diving headfirst into the rhythm as though they had been waiting years for it. The crowd erupted. Shock first, then hysteria. People leapt to their feet, the rich and the working class alike, suddenly thrust backward in time. To some, it was memory. The first time they'd dropped a needle on a scratchy 45, hearing the wildness in his voice through a cheap speaker. To others, it was revelation. This wasn't the Vegas spectacle of rhinestones and rehearsed medleys. This was the unvarnished flame that had started it all. Every movement of his body, every snap of his hips, carried a charge that bypassed the glittering exterior of the Hilton. His eyes lit with mischief. He wasn't just singing, he was daring. Daring the heckler, daring the critics, daring himself. The song spilled into the air like it was breaking loose from decades of careful stagecraft, and with it came the unmistakable feeling that the man before them had peeled away his armor. The cameras positioned discreetly around the room caught everything. They had been hired to archive the performance for internal records, never meant to capture history. But now their reels whirred in disbelief as they framed something unexpected. Elvis Presley, the international star in his Vegas prime, channeling the raw rockabilly boy from Memphis. Nobody in the control booth dared look away. They knew instinctively they were recording something future fans would fight to witness. The effect on the audience was tidal. The initial jolt of surprise gave way to fever. Women in evening gowns clapped above their heads, their diamonds flashing like sparks. Men loosened their ties, pounding the tabletops in rhythm. In the balcony, kids screamed as though they'd been transported back to the Ed Sullivan broadcast their parents had described. The shout that had begun as a jeer was drowned in the roar of thousands rediscovering the reason they loved him. Yet amid the celebration, there was something deeper. The moment revealed itself not as nostalgia, but as testimony. Elvis wasn't arguing with words. He was proving with sound, with the conviction in each note, that real wasn't a question of style or decade. It was the force that had carried him from a shotgun house in Tupelo to that very stage. He didn't need to defend himself. He just had to sing. By the second verse, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his grin had widened into something fierce, almost boyish. He stomped the stage, the leather of his boots slapping the floor, and the room answered with a quake of applause. The tension that had threatened to fracture the evening was gone, replaced by a communion of energy so overwhelming that even the heckler, wherever he sat, seemed to vanish into insignificance. When the final chord crashed and his voice faded, the applause hit like thunder. People were on their feet, hands stinging from clapping, throats raw from cheering. The orchestra members looked at each other, some laughing, some shaking their heads, as if they too had been carried off balance. Nobody had seen it coming, least of all them. Elvis lowered the microphone, breathing heavily, but his eyes still burned. He hadn't raised his voice to confront the challenge, hadn't lashed back with ego. Instead, he had drawn a line through history, reminding the room that before Vegas, before Hollywood, before the crowns and nicknames, there was a man with a guitar and a song that didn't ask permission to exist. The irony was not lost on the audience. What was meant as a jab had ignited a revelation. In trying to diminish him, the heckler had inadvertently unlocked the purest display of his artistry. The audience knew it. The musicians knew it. And Elvis himself, as he leaned against the microphone stand with that half-smile still lingering, knew it most of all. For a heartbeat, the hall buzzed in near silence after the eruption, people catching their breath, staring as though afraid the spell would break. And then, from the rear of the showroom, another surge of applause rolled forward, cascading in waves until it was deafening again. The walls seemed to shake with the weight of it. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "That's the Elvis I remember." Another murmured, "That's the Elvis I never thought I'd see again." Strangers clasped hands, smiling through tears they couldn't quite explain. The man who had been challenged to sing something real had done exactly that. And as the camera's word, sealing the proof into celluloid, nobody in the Hilton showroom could doubt that they had just witnessed a moment that would be talked about for decades. What had begun as disruption had transformed into triumph, and Elvis, standing tall with sweat running down his brow, and the crowd at his feet, had only just begun to answer, showroom like thunder. People were still on their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices hoarse, when Elvis raised a hand to quiet them. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the noise subsided. The room exhaled together, expecting him to launch into the next number with his trademark grin. But instead, his expression shifted. The playful sparkle in his eyes dimmed into something more serious, almost intimate. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady, stripped of the stage's gloss. "I sing for you every night, and everything that comes out of me, every note, every word, is real. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here." The hall fell into a hush again. The laughter and cheers of moments earlier gave way to an uneasy stillness, as if people had suddenly realized the performer before them wasn't playing a role anymore. Applause broke out in bursts, but it wasn't the wild celebration from before. It was quieter, more thoughtful, tinged with respect. He let it wash over him briefly, then lifted his hand again, this time not to silence the crowd, but to press further. "I know some folks out there think I've turned into too much of a show business act," he continued, "but let me tell you something. Every night, I walk a line between two fires. This stage and the life I live when the lights go out." The words struck like arrows. This wasn't a rehearsed monologue. It was confession. His voice carried the kind of raw truth rarely spoken under the blinding glare of spotlights. In the crowd, people shifted uneasily, as though intruding on a private exchange. The man who had shouted earlier sat frozen, caught in the spotlight of his own provocation. His friends tugged at his sleeve, muttering for him to calm down, but he barely moved. He had expected fury, sarcasm, maybe a humiliation he could brush off later with bravado. Instead, he was staring at a man bearing his soul in front of thousands. The tension was unbearable. Then Elvis, with a deliberate pivot, turned it into music again. He gave a nod to the band, not the raucous cue of the last surprise number, but something slower, gentler. The first chords drifted like a sigh across the room, and then his voice followed, tender and haunting. It was a ballad he seldom performed in Vegas, something that reached deeper than the glitz of the Strip. Notes of "You'll Never Walk Alone" floated from his lips. Or perhaps it was "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Either way, the song wasn't chosen for spectacle. It was chosen for truth. His voice filled the vast showroom with a tremor that carried the weight of every weary night, every battle with doubt, every question of worth. The transformation in the room was immediate. Faces softened, tears welled in eyes that moments earlier had been narrowed with judgment. Couples leaned into each other. A man in the balcony held his wife's hand tighter, her shoulders shaking as she wept openly. Even those who had arrived skeptical, wealthy patrons treating the evening like a fashionable diversion, now found themselves pulled into the gravity of the moment. The camera operators glanced at each other, stunned. They had expected to capture another polished Vegas performance, but what filled their lenses now was something else entirely. Elvis's face, illuminated by the spotlight, bore no mask of performance, only the naked conviction of a man singing as if the song were the last truth he had left to tell. By the time he reached the chorus, the hall had dissolved into silence so pure it bordered on reverence. The man who had shouted, "Sing something real," now sat hunched forward, his jaw slack, his defiance gone. He wasn't jeering anymore. He was listening, transfixed, like everyone else. The final note lingered, quivering in the rafters, before fading into the still air. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No coughs, no whispers, not even the clink of a glass. And then the eruption came. Applause, cheers, cries that rose to the ceiling and came crashing down again. People leapt to their feet, this time not in frenzy but in tribute. It wasn't the ovation of fans watching a star. It was the gratitude of souls touched by something larger than entertainment. Elvis stood still through it all, his chest rising and falling heavily, sweat streaking down his temple. He hadn't conquered the room with swagger. He hadn't shouted down the challenge. He had disarmed it with vulnerability. The duel had been fought not with words, but with heart. The heckler, once so loud, now seemed invisible among the crowd of believers. And the irony was sharp. The man who had tried to puncture the illusion had forced Elvis to show the truest version of himself. And the audience, once divided, now felt united in a way none of them had anticipated. Elvis leaned once more into the microphone, his voice quieter, almost conversational. "You see, friends, I can't be anything but what I am. On this stage, I try to give you all I've got, and that's as real as it gets." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They floated across the room, sinking into every heart that beat there. And as the orchestra readied the next number, the crowd knew the evening had already crossed into something unforgettable. What had begun as confrontation had become communion, and the man in the white suit stood not as a distant icon, but as a fellow traveler on the same unsteady road of doubt, hope, and redemption. The duel was over, but the night was far from done. The applause still rattled through the cavernous Hilton showroom when Elvis lowered the microphone, letting the last echoes of the ballad fade. He didn't rush to break the silence. He stood with one hand resting on the mic stand, head tilted slightly down, eyes distant. For a moment, it looked as if he might speak and then thought better of it. The crowd, electrified only moments earlier, now sat in breathless quiet, hanging on whatever would come next. Elvis lifted his gaze. His voice, when it came, was softer than before, almost hesitant, as though he were pulling something out of a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. "You know," he began, "this ain't the first time someone told me what I sing isn't real. Back in Memphis, before any of this." He gestured around at the glittering stage, the orchestra, the shimmering suits in the front rows. "Folks used to tell me the same thing." The audience leaned in, surprised. This wasn't the kind of story they were accustomed to hearing in the middle of a Vegas performance. "I remember playing in little clubs," he continued. "We'd load the gear into the back of an old car, scrape together gas money, and try to make the rent at the end of the week. People didn't know what to make of the music. Some laughed. Some said it was a fad. Some told me straight out it didn't belong anywhere. And you know what? For a long time, I wondered if they were right." A ripple moved through the room. It wasn't the polished showman speaking now. It was the boy from Tupelo, confessing his doubts to thousands of strangers. The Hilton showroom, usually a monument to spectacle, suddenly felt like a back porch on a summer night. Then he paused, his voice dropping even lower. "Truth is, I still feel that way sometimes. After all these years, all the records, all the tours, I step out here, and a part of me still wonders if I deserve to be standing in front of you." The words landed like stones. People shifted in their seats, caught off guard by the admission. To hear someone who had conquered the world confess to insecurity was disarming, almost painful. Yet it drew them closer. Strangers who had never spoken to each other found themselves exchanging glances, their eyes wet. Elvis let the silence sit heavy for a beat, then drew in a breath. "I'll tell you something I don't talk about much. When I was drafted into the Army back in '58, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe music was done for me. I was just another guy in uniform, halfway around the world in Germany. And you know, it was the first time in years nobody treated me like a star. I was just Presley. I cleaned the barracks. I stood guard. I did what the sergeant told me to do. And let me tell you, there was something real about that." The crowd chuckled softly at the image of the king of rock and roll cleaning floors like any other soldier. But their laughter was tinged with admiration. The distance between the man on stage and the people in the seats shrank with every word. "I learned something then," Elvis went on. "Doesn't matter where you are. Memphis, Hollywood, Vegas, Germany, you're still you. You can't run from it, and you can't fake it for long." His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory. Then, almost without warning, he raised his hand to the orchestra. A familiar swell of strings and brass lifted into the air, and the opening strains of An American Trilogy poured from the stage. The audience gasped. The song was monumental, a tapestry of hymns and folk tunes woven into a single anthem. His voice soared, shifting from a hushed whisper to a thunderous cry, dragging every soul in the room through the history and struggle it carried. It wasn't just performance. It was declaration. Each note cracked open the vulnerability he had revealed moments earlier and filled it with strength. In the front rows, people rose to their feet instinctively. Others followed until the entire room was standing, hands clasped, eyes glistening. The showroom no longer resembled a Vegas lounge. It felt like a sacred space. Some cried openly, unashamed, as his voice thundered above the orchestra, filled with conviction and sorrow and hope. The cameramen, their lenses fixed on him, whispered to one another that this was something the world had to see. They could sense it in their bones. A piece of history was being etched into celluloid in real time. As the song reached its peak, Elvis leaned back, pouring everything in him into the final notes. The spotlight bathed him in stark white, sweat gleaming on his face, his mouth open in a cry that seemed to rise from the deepest part of his soul. And then, silence again. The last note hung in the air, vibrating like a ghost, and then was gone. The room exploded. People screamed, clapped, shouted his name. Some waved handkerchiefs, others simply stood with their arms raised as though in prayer. The ovation seemed endless, cascading like waves that would never recede. Elvis, his chest heaving, bowed his head. He didn't bask in it. He absorbed it quietly, his expression unreadable, as though the cheers belonged to someone else. For a fleeting moment, the crowd glimpsed a man not exalted by their adoration, but humbled by it, almost burdened. And still he said nothing. He let the cheers pour over him, unbroken, until the noise itself became another kind of silence, one filled with awe, with gratitude, with the knowledge that they had witnessed something larger than themselves. The boy from Memphis, the soldier from Germany, the superstar of Vegas, all three stood on that stage, united in one figure, and the audience knew they were looking at more than an entertainer. They were looking at a man revealing pieces of his soul in ways few ever dared. The memory of that moment would never leave them. They thought they had come for a concert. Instead, they had stumbled into a confession, a sermon, a history lesson, and a revelation, woven together by a single man in white, singing with everything he had left to give. The applause roared on. But deep down, everyone in the room sensed that something had shifted again, and the night was still gathering toward something greater, something more dangerous, something unforgettable. The ovation from An American Trilogy still shook the showroom like an earthquake. People were clapping through tears, many unwilling to sit down, their hearts raw from what they had just witnessed. The Hilton staff, seasoned in Vegas spectacle, stood frozen at the edges of the room, stunned by the transformation of the glittering lounge into something closer to a cathedral. And then, cutting through the storm of applause, another voice rose, harsh, accusatory. "You sold out to Hollywood!" The words landed like a slap across the face of the entire room. Gasps shot through the audience, and for a moment, the clapping faltered. The heckle was sharper than the first one, more personal. It wasn't a challenge to the music. It was an attack on his integrity, a knife aimed straight at his soul. The crowd reacted instantly. People booed, shouted, "Sit down!" and "Shut your mouth!" Others craned their necks to spot the culprit. A few even stood, pointing toward the shadowy section where the voice had emerged. The atmosphere, which only moments earlier had brimmed with reverence, now turned volatile. Security, dressed in dark suits, moved quickly down the aisles. They had been waiting for a moment like this, prepared to escort the troublemaker out before he could do more damage. The audience cheered them on, eager for the intruder to be silenced. But then Elvis lifted his hand. The guards froze. The crowd fell into confusion. Elvis shook his head slowly, his gaze steady, his voice clear enough for every corner of the hall to hear. "Let him be," he said. "That's freedom talking. We don't hush that up." The room gasped. The tension shifted in an instant. The very man being insulted had just defended the heckler's right to speak. Some in the audience clapped at his words. Others simply stared in disbelief. The gesture was so unexpected, so disarming, that even the most furious voices were silenced. Elvis adjusted the microphone, his face solemn. "People are always going to have their say. That's part of living here. And maybe—" he paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe that man ain't the only one who ever thought it." The confession cut deep. By acknowledging the criticism, he stripped it of its sting. And then, without waiting for another word, he turned to the orchestra and gave a subtle nod. What followed was unlike anything the Vegas stage had ever heard. The strings swelled gently, almost tentatively, and Elvis began to sing an old gospel hymn from his boyhood, a song the Hilton's glittering regulars had never expected to hear. His voice softened into something unearthly, warm and reverent, reaching back to the tiny churches of Tupelo, where he had first learned to close his eyes and lose himself in song. It wasn't show business. It was prayer. The showroom shifted. The chandeliers still sparkled. The waiters still froze in place, but the room felt different now. The lights seemed dimmer, the air heavier. Some in the audience clasped their hands. Others bowed their heads instinctively, as though they had been swept into a sacred gathering rather than a Saturday night concert. Even the heckler, whose accusation had just torn through the hall, sat motionless, his bravado gone. His shoulders hunched, his head tilted slightly down, as if the hymn had struck a place he hadn't expected to be touched. Elvis's voice carried the weight of memory, the sound of nights spent with his mother in small wooden churches, where people sang with cracked voices and pure hearts. Every line, every note, seemed to strip away the rhinestones and spotlight, until all that was left was a man and his truth. When the final verse faded, the silence was crushing. Nobody moved. Not a glass clinked, not a cough sounded. It was as if the entire room had been pressed into stillness by something invisible, something larger than all of them. Then Elvis raised his head. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, his voice calm but charged with conviction. All my life people have asked me, "Are you a rock and roller, a movie star, a showman?" And I've always told them the same thing. I'm just a man trying to sing the truth the way I feel it. The words landed heavy, anchoring themselves in the minds of everyone present. No neon sign, no casino marquee could match the force of that declaration. The audience, moved beyond anything they had anticipated, erupted, not in the frenzied shrieks of earlier, but in applause that sounded more like a collective pledge. They weren't just clapping for a performance anymore. They were clapping for a man who had bared his soul, and, in the process, drawn them into his own struggle. The heckler sat quietly, overwhelmed, forgotten by the crowd, but pinned in place by the enormity of what he had unleashed. What had begun as disruption had been turned, once again, into revelation. And for Elvis, the night pressed forward, its edges sharper, its stakes higher. The duel between skepticism and sincerity wasn't over yet. If anything, it was reaching its most dangerous peak. The hymn still lingered in the air like incense, its final notes clinging to the walls of the Hilton showroom long after Elvis's voice had fallen silent. The crowd stood transfixed, as though any sudden movement would shatter the fragile sanctity he had conjured. For a man who had spent years wrapped in spectacle, it was astonishing how much power he now wielded through restraint. Then, with slow deliberation, Elvis stepped back from the microphone. He removed a silk handkerchief from his belt and dabbed his brow, the spotlight gleaming off the rhinestones stitched across his jumpsuit. His eyes swept the audience, not with the playful mischief of earlier shows, but with something far weightier, almost searching. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher, like a man speaking not to entertain, but to confess. "You know," he said, "sometimes I ask myself the same thing that fella asked me earlier. Am I real up here? Or is it just the lights, the suit, the sound of applause?" A ripple moved through the hall. The audience leaned forward instinctively, drawn in by the raw candor. The glamour of Vegas was gone now. What remained was a man standing before thousands, questioning himself aloud. He took a step closer to the mic, his voice lowering to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner. "And every time I wrestle with it, I come back to one thought. If a song I sing helps somebody get through their night, just one person, then that's real enough for me." The words struck like a spark in dry grass. From the middle rows, a woman rose suddenly, her voice breaking as she shouted through tears, "Your song saved my son's life." The declaration hung in the air, raw and unplanned. The audience gasped, and then the entire room erupted into applause so thunderous it seemed to make the chandeliers quiver. Strangers turned to each other, some wiping tears, some clapping until their palms burned. The barrier between stage and seats dissolved completely. Elvis stood motionless, visibly moved. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. He just nodded, his face taut with emotion. That single cry from the woman had done more than any critic, any award, any contract. It had given him proof. Proof that what he poured out night after night mattered. Then, in an act of quiet rebellion against his own routine, he did something almost no one in the Hilton had ever seen. He walked to the side of the stage where a grand piano gleamed under the spotlight. The audience murmured in surprise. Elvis rarely touched the piano during Vegas shows. It was an instrument tied more to private rehearsals and late-night moments than to the glittering showcase of the Strip. He lowered himself onto the bench, his back straight, his fingers brushing the keys as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. The hall hushed again, anticipation swelling to a breaking point. And then, softly, he began to play. The opening notes of Unchained Melody floated out, delicate and trembling, like a secret laid bare. At that time, in 1972, it was not yet part of his repertoire. It was something entirely unexpected. The crowd collectively gasped, recognizing the melody, yet stunned to hear it from him. His voice followed, quivering at first, then gaining strength. Gone was the theatrical precision of Vegas arrangements. This was stripped, unpolished, almost fragile. Every note felt like it was being pulled straight from his chest, raw and unshielded. The effect was devastating. People leaned forward, clutching the edges of their tables. Some wept openly. Others clasped hands across aisles with strangers they'd never met. It was no longer about a performance. It was communion. Thousands of voices breathed in rhythm with his, united in the fragile beauty of a moment they hadn't expected but would never forget. As the chorus swelled, something extraordinary happened. Members of the audience began to sing with him, softly at first, timid, unsure, but soon louder, steadier. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns, teenagers in the balcony, waiters frozen at the back. All of them lifted their voices until the Hilton showroom was no longer a stage, but a single vast choir. Elvis, his eyes shut tight, played on. The sound rose around him, enveloping him, as if the audience had become part of the performance itself. His shoulders trembled with the weight of the song, his voice cracked slightly, but instead of diminishing him, it deepened the truth of it. When he reached the final note, his voice stretched long and thin, carried on sheer willpower. His fingers released the keys, leaving only the echo of the melody suspended in the cavernous room. For several seconds, there was nothing. Just the heavy breathing of thousands of people who knew they had experienced something singular, something sacred. And then the applause came. Not as a roar, but as a tidal wave. People shouted his name, pounded tables, reached for each other in joy and disbelief. Many were crying, unashamed. The Hilton showroom had seen its share of legends, but it had never witnessed anything like this. 18,000 people singing as one with a man who, in that moment, was no king, no idol, but simply human. Elvis sat at the piano, his hands resting on his thighs, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. He opened his eyes slowly, scanning the room, taking in the sight of strangers embracing, men wiping their eyes, women mouthing, "Thank you," through their tears. What had started as confrontation, born from a heckler's challenge, had now reached a climax no one could have imagined. The duel wasn't just over, it had been transcended. In that instant, the question of what was real no longer mattered. Everyone in the Hilton showroom knew the answer, and Elvis Presley, sweat-soaked and trembling but standing tall in spirit, had never looked more human. Or more true. The ovation after Unchained Melody seemed endless. People were on their feet, clapping furiously, shouting his name through tears. The Hilton showroom shook under the force of it. Yet Elvis remained seated at the piano, shoulders bowed, breathing hard. He didn't smile, didn't bow theatrically. He simply let the applause wash over him, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. And then, slowly, he rose. He walked back to center stage, the spotlight following his every step. The orchestra looked to him, waiting for the familiar signal that meant the show would close with its scheduled finale. But Elvis didn't raise his hand. He just stood there, microphone in hand, gazing into the shadows of the audience. His eyes lingered on the dark section of the hall where it had all begun, where that first sharp cry, "Sing something real," had cut through the night and set everything in motion. He lifted the microphone to his lips, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "That was for you, friend," he said, "and for all of us." The words struck the room like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Cameras panned instinctively toward the section he addressed. There, in the dim light, sat the man who had launched the night's chain of events. He was no longer jeering, no longer leaning back in arrogant defiance. His head was bowed, his hands clasped together between his knees. Around him, his friends applauded wildly. But he didn't move. He couldn't lift his eyes. The challenge he had thrown had been answered, not with insult or anger, but with music so true it had laid him bare. The audience, sensing the weight of the moment, erupted in cheers again, but Elvis didn't wait to bask in it. He turned from the microphone, gave no signal to the orchestra, no wave to the crowd. Instead, he walked toward the side of the stage, his white cape trailing behind him, rhinestones catching the light like embers as he disappeared into the wings. For a long second, nobody moved. The orchestra members looked at one another in confusion. Stagehands peered from behind curtains. The spotlight, left with nothing to illuminate, swung aimlessly across the shimmering audience before finally snapping off. And then realization spread. He wasn't coming back. The applause returned, louder, frenzied, desperate now. People shouted his name, begged for an encore. They clapped until their palms stung, stomped their feet until the floor rattled, convinced he had to return. But he didn't. Minutes passed. The stage remained dark. Still, the crowd refused to leave. Strangers clung to each other, talking, crying, trying to understand what they had just experienced. It wasn't anger in the room, it was awe, disbelief that such a night could end so abruptly, so unceremoniously. Some people sat in stunned silence, unable to move from their chairs. Others walked slowly toward the exits, whispering to one another as if leaving a sacred place. A few lingered in the aisles, still glancing back toward the empty stage, half expecting him to return. But Elvis had made his statement. By leaving without the grand bow, without the planned finale, he had turned the night into something larger than show business. He had refused to gild it with routine. Instead, he had left the audience holding the raw truth of what had happened. One man, pushed by a heckler's words, had turned a Vegas spectacle into an unrepeatable revelation. In the days that followed, stories spread like wildfire. Some swore they had seen Elvis cry at the piano. Others insisted the heckler himself had wept as the ballad filled the hall. A few claimed the moment, with the woman shouting about her son, had been divine intervention. Whether details blurred or sharpened in retelling didn't matter. What mattered was the legend that took root. One night in Las Vegas, a man demanded Elvis sing something real, and the king of rock and roll answered in a way that silenced 18,000 people and left them forever changed. For those who had been there, the memory never faded. Couples told the story at dinner parties decades later. Parents recounted it to children, their voices still catching with emotion. Some even carried the ticket stubs in their wallets for years, as if to prove to themselves that it had actually happened. And the man who had shouted the first words? He slipped back into anonymity, his name forgotten, his face blurred in memory. But those who were there remembered the bowed head, the silence that followed him. In a strange way, his heckle had become a gift, a catalyst for one of the most extraordinary nights of Elvis Presley's career. What lingered most was not the songs themselves, though they were unforgettable, but the feeling. The sense of standing in a room where something holy had broken through the glitter, where time had stopped, and everyone, rich or poor, skeptic or believer, had been united for a few fleeting hours by a single voice. And when people spoke of it in later years, they always ended the same way. You had to be there. You had to see it with your own eyes. It was the night Elvis showed us what real truly meant.